Hello and welcome to this week's lecture. Today we're going to be talking about the importance of the communications process in public relations. And it's really all about especially listening skills and how to maintain good communications with stakeholders. I think we've been learning all along in the course. We saw it with our particularly case study 1 that it is important to communicate with stakeholders, both the internal and external stakeholders. There, as a matter of fact, has been a lot of research on this, and particularly we know that the more effective you are as an administrator at communicating, the more effective your school can be. Now, what does this effective communication depend on? Well, it really depends on 4 components. That is, your knowledge about the topic, obviously, that you're speaking about. For example, if you're trying to communicate the results of a new initiative to a parent body, you'll want to be very versed and knowledgeable about the outcomes of that new initiative. Skills. Listening skills, for example, which we'll be covering in this particular module. Dispositions. People can sense when you're in a bad mood, when you have a negative attitude. There's a lot that's communicated non-verbally by your attitudes towards things. That's what we mean by dispositions. And also, finally, by your position. So, do you have authority, for example, to communicate about a topic? In 1960, Berlow developed a seminal model that described 4 elements of communication, and this is called the SMCR model because it stands for the 4 components, the first letter, source, message, channel, and receiver. Berlow said that the source is the person who encodes the message. So think about what that word encodes means. We think about encoding, for example, with certain security aspects where data are encoded. But all communication really is encoded. It's encoded into verbal and nonverbal gestures, and it's up to the person listening to be able to interpret that. The message, obviously, is what is encoded, and that, again, can be verbal, words, using words, and nonverbal, using other types of communication, or in fact, nonverbal communication can be things that aren't said, but that are very much communicated, for example, through body language. The channel is the manner in which the message is conveyed. Perhaps it's written, perhaps it's spoken out loud, perhaps it's through the internet, for example. And the receiver is the person to whom the message is sent and bringing his or her own interpretation to the message and decoding it. So it's a very complex process. Sometimes what we mean to say is not what we're really saying, and sometimes what is heard is not what is really being said. So all of these affect how effective the message becomes. There are certain characteristics to all communication. For example, the form, like I said, could be verbal or nonverbal communication. The flow of the communication could be one way or two ways. So if you post something, for example, on a school website, unless there's a feedback loop, that's a one-way communication. Verbal communication with other people tends to be two-way. Status is whether it's formal or informal. We all know there's a difference, for example, between the emails we write formally, for example, if you're writing to your superior, versus whether you're writing to a friend. And finally, the action, whether you're doing the sending or doing the receiving. We're going to delve a little more deeply into something that's very important to communication, and especially to communication with administrators as listening skills. because we know from Dolan in 1996 that approximately 75% of all interactions in a school are one-on-one meetings. So a majority of the communication that is occurring in your school is occurring from face-to-face, one-on-one types of conversations. And many times these conversations are not really effective at communicating because of miscommunication errors. Now, why should a simple conversation lead to miscommunication? Well, that may happen for a number of reasons. Golan in 1990 identified a number of reasons why miscommunication might occur. Poor listening skills, because as you're listening, you may appear disinterested, and sometimes you're really not disinterested. Sometimes you are very interested in what the person is having to say, but perhaps you're a bit distracted. Maybe as an administrator, you're listening to your teacher, and you've got the next appointment in your head, and you've got your child's soccer league practice coming up, and you're distracted. So you're not really paying attention to what's being said. Sometimes you might be showing bias. So a teacher comes to you with a complaint, for example, about needing more funding for her classroom, and you may feel that teachers have received enough funding, and you may be a little irritated at this point that she is coming to you for this, and so your bias may be showing through. And this may be, even though you're saying words that might try to resolve the situation, if your attitude or disposition is biased, the teacher is likely to pick up on that. So there's a lot that goes on in the context of communication other than just what is said, and it's important to be aware of the pitfalls. Well, when you're developing good listening skills, it's important to understand that listening is really a three-dimensional process. Most people just think of it as hearing, which is shown at the bottom of this slide. But hearing is just really the first step. Hearing means paying attention, making eye contact with the communicator, really giving the person who is trying to talk with you your full and undivided attention. It could also mean smiling, acknowledging their verbal communication. The second part, though, is a little more sophisticated, and that's really understanding the message that is being communicated. So actively, cognitively engaging with that message, what is really being said, is a question you should be asking yourself as an administrator. Sometimes people are poor communicators. Maybe they come to you and they're tired. Maybe they come to you and they've had a rough day and they come off a little more negatively, for example, than they intended. So it's up to you to really try to understand the heart of the message. And finally, the last step is judging. As an administrator, you have to make thousands of decisions each day, and you have to process the information that's being communicated to you. You need to find some way, after you've developed a clear understanding, of judging what your reaction is going to be to this message. There are 5 skills that you can begin to develop as a good communicator, as an effective administrator. Later in this module, you'll be asked to do a communication activity, and you'll want to refer back to the slide and really understand these strategies deeply to be able to do that activity. One of the first things that you can begin to do is to be able to accurately decode the message that is being communicated to you. So what does active decoding means? Well, it means, first of all, listening very carefully, as I said before, to be able to understand what the communicator is trying to get across. It means Observing as well. You might observe the person's facial expression. You might observe the person's body language. And you might think about the words that are being selected. All of these are clues that you can very carefully think about as active decoding is going on. It's important to think about the nonverbal communication, as I just said, as it is to think about the verbal communication. The second strategy that you can use is called paralanguage. And paralanguage basically just means to be able to develop parallel language. In other words, putting it into your own words in your head as the communicator is going along. So, for example, if you're communicating with a teacher and the teacher says, you know, I really hate it when the school buses, leave late because the teachers wind up standing out on the curb and waiting for the children to leave, and I always get home. What kind of message is being given here, and what could you do to put that in paralanguage? You might say, the teacher is feeling frustrated because she is being asked to assume duties outside of what she believes her responsibility is. Retention is another good strategy. In the strategy of retention, you actively try to remember as much information as you possibly can. You retain that information. Some administrators find it's helpful to take notes, to jot down notes. But always, if you're going to do that, you should ask permission to jot down notes and explain the purpose. It's to help me remember your comments. Verification involves the process of giving back the information to the communicator. I'm hearing you say that you feel frustrated because you have to leave late because of the tardiness of the school buses. Is that correct? Might be an example that you say to a teacher. And finally, effective feedback. This involves providing feedback to the teacher or to the person who's trying to communicate you with effective suggestions for how to handle the situation. These 5 good listening skills will help to improve your communication with all stakeholders, not only teachers.